One of the things that we did in the early days of 2014 was kind of just looked around and said, I think we have an opportunity to make a couple of choices that will be bold and aggressive that give us a shot to re-win relevance with developers of the world. And if we don't, we're going to be on an iceberg that's going to slowly melt. And at some point, we're going to be swimming. And so we kind of had a set of meetings in spring of 2014 and kind of wrote on the whiteboard, let's be bold, and came up with three big things that we said, okay, what can we do to become more relevant? And the first one was we actually introduced a community edition of Visual Studio. Decision number two is let's open source .NET and let's make it cross-platform. We want the community to contribute code and do it under the right license and put it on GitHub. And then decision number three was, as much as we love Visual Studio, the IDE, let's also recognize increasingly web developers and those that are not using a compiled language are looking for something that's much more of a lightweight code optimized editor. And there was a great project that had been started. It was basically a web-based editor written in Node, written in TypeScript, but it ran in a VS Online. It was great technology, but at the time people weren't really looking to write code in a browser. And the three different decisions we made, we kind of made all those decisions, I think, in about an hour and a half. Of the three decisions, they were all very big. The ones that we remember the most would be VS Code and then the open sourcing of .NET.
Microsoft was founded 50 years ago in 1975. So how has the company changed and how it builds developer tools across these 5 decades? Today, I sat down with Scott Guthrie, who has been with Microsoft for 28 years, created the first prototype version of ASP.NET, and is currently the Executive Vice President for Cloud and AI. In this episode, we talk about a few decades of Microsoft and how Windows became a success in part thanks to shipping programming tools like QuickC or MFC to help devs build programs on top of the OS. How and why Visual Basic, C#, ASP.NET, and Visual Studio were created. The time when developers paid thousands of dollars per year to access quality documentation over MSDN, how Microsoft decided to embrace open source and create VS Code as an open source project, and many more topics, including what Scott is excited about looking ahead. This is a rare conversation with Scott, who has been with Microsoft for over more than half his lifetime, and I hope you enjoy the stories and details that he shares with us. So Scott, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It is so nice to meet again, especially that we've met a long time ago, 10 years ago, and then I also worked at Microsoft. But today, I'd like to just go back to way to the beginning. 50 years ago, it's crazy to say that, that's when Microsoft was founded. And when I think about Microsoft, my first memory is Windows, but actually, it started with developer tools, right?
Yeah, the very first product that Microsoft built, and really, not just the first product, but for many years, we were just a developer tools company. And so it was Microsoft Basic for the Altair, and Bill and Paul Allen built it while Bill was still in Harvard. And, the legend is they flew out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where the company that built the Altair was. The computer no longer exists, obviously. And they brought a tape of Microsoft Basic, or a paper tape, and they actually plugged it in and loaded it, and it worked. And it was actually, they built the app Basic entirely without access to the computer. And it was kind of the hit product for that particular computer, and then they expanded to other platforms, and then eventually operating
But the first
systems.
dollars they made by selling basically a developer tool, a compiler, right? So like you could write basic code and it would compile to machine code, right? That was the product, right?
I think it was an interpreter at that time.
The interpreter, yeah.
But basically, yeah. I mean, it was literally, and back then that was how you kind of used computers. Is often you were a programmer and you actually, I guess today would be modern equivalent would be scripting, and you built your own logic and your own applications. And so yeah, it's that's one of the things that's been cool is that the company started as a developer tools company, and when you look at what we build today, whether it's VS Code, whether it's GitHub, whether it's Azure, we remain a developer tools company.
If you want to build a great product, you have to ship quickly. But how do you know what works? More importantly, how do you avoid shipping things that don't work? The answer, StatSig. StatSig is a unified platform for flags, analytics, experiments, and more, combining 5+ products into a single platform with a unified set of data. Here's how it works. First, StatSig helps you ship a feature via feature flag or config. Then, it measures how it's working, from alerts and errors, to replays of people using that feature, to measurement of top-line impact. Then you get your analytics, user account metrics, and dashboards to track your progress over time, all linked to the stuff you ship. Even better, StatSig is incredibly affordable. With the super generous free tier, a starter program with $50,000 of free credits, and custom plans that help you consolidate your existing spend on flags, analytics, or A/B testing tools. To get started, go to statsig.com/pragmatic. That is statsig.com/pragmatic. Happy building! This episode is brought to you by Cinch, the customer communications cloud trusted by thousands of engineering teams around the world. If you've ever added messaging, voice, or email into a product, you know the pain. Flaky delivery and platforms stacked with middlemen. Cinch is different. They run their own network with direct carrier connections in over 60 countries. That means faster delivery, higher reliability, and scale that just works. Developers love Cinch for its single API that covers 12 channels, including SMS, WhatsApp, and RCS. Now is the time to pay attention to RCS, Rich Communication Services. It's like SMS but smarter. Your brand name, logo, and verified checkmark all inside the native messaging app. Built by Google, now rolling out with Apple and major carriers, RCS is becoming the messaging standard. Cinch is helping teams go live globally. Learn more at cinch.com/pragmatic. That is SINCH.com/pragmatic. And just stepping forward from basics, this was 1975, but in the 90s, or actually like mid-80s, Microsoft started to become big because of Windows. And as I looked into the history, I was pretty surprised to see that as Microsoft developed Windows 1.0 and then 3.0 and 3.1 was a big breakthrough, they always developed programs to build on top of Windows. So they did Quick Basic, Microsoft C, and Quick C. Do you think, having talked with early Microsoft employees and just knowing the history, was this an intentional strategy? Or might have this thing actually helped Windows become as big as it did?
Well, I think it absolutely helped Windows become as big as it is. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're building an operating system or you're building a cloud platform, your success is very much, no one buys a platform by itself. They buy it for the applications that run on top. And so if you don't have developers, building those applications, you don't have a business. And so I think definitely in the early days with Windows, part of the whole thesis was, build great tools, make it easy to build applications that are great, help developers be successful. And if their apps are successful, we'll sell more Windows. And it's similar today with Azure in terms of, one of the things I covered in my keynote was ChatGPT, which runs, entirely on Azure. And, it's another great example of, how do we make, in this case, a company, OpenAI, successful and enable them to build an amazing app. And if they are successful and they're running on our platform, we're successful too. And so it's a model that I think is very much core to the DNA of the company.
Yeah, and then in the 90s, as Windows became more popular and there was these tools, Microsoft did something really, really interesting. They built some tools that allowed maybe not as technical developers to build stuff. Visual Basic, Microsoft Access, later Microsoft Front Page. And I'm now having a little bit of deja vu of what we're seeing today, but just reflecting on that time and what you've seen. Visual Basic seems to still have a massive impact. Even when I worked at a bank at JP Morgan, building like software that was used by professional traders, some of the traders loved using Visual Basic that they, as non-technical people, could write their own programs.
Yeah, Visual Basic at the time was absolutely revolutionary because I remember I was in high school. And I was a developer on the Mac. Maybe System 7 had just come out. It was like a long time ago on the Mac, pre, OS 10 and everything. And, building a GUI application was a lot of work. If you wanted a menu, if you wanted buttons, if you wanted dialogue, I mean, you were writing a lot of code. And it was often very error-prone code because if you got anything wrong, it would crash. And there were no visual designers. It was pretty much, you kind of had to do everything from scratch. And Visual Basic came along and it was sort of, you could drag and drop buttons, visually lay them out, double click, write a couple lines of code, hit F5 and it ran. And it really transformed development. And, we ultimately took that same paradigm and used it with Access for databases. We also had a product, which was one of the ones I used. I think it was the first thing I ever got paid for, was a product called Visual Fox Pro, which was another database product that was graphical, and then extended it to things like Visual J++, and then ultimately the Visual Studio family, including C#, C++, and others. And so, it's that notion of, again, it was core to like, how do we take the friction out of what developers needed to do and provide great developer tools to do it. And as much as, the drag and drop aspect of Visual Basic was revolutionary, the other thing that was revolutionary was just the speed with which you could run. And it had pioneered a feature called edit and continue. So you could even have the application running, modify a couple lines of code, and then push the button again. And without having to kind of rebuild or recompile or relaunch, you could actually see the edits immediately take effect. And that was also kind of transformative. Today with JavaScript, we're sort of used to that kind of paradigm of make a change, hit save, and it just works. But, in the 90s, it was radical in a big way.
Can we just rewind back time? Because I feel there's a bit of a similarity. Like back then, up in the 90s, before Visual Basic and Access and Foxroll came about, there was, no way for like non-super technical people who knew, you learned the syntax to write programs. And these things just allowed, honestly, everyday people like my dad, who was not a developer, he put together a bunch of stuff with Access, later Fox Pro. And today we're in a similar thing, but I'd like to know, like, do you remember what the mood was like? Were developers saying like, "Oh no, this is the end of development. We're now, like we're not going to have work"? Was there any of this? And then what happened as a result of this? Because now we have like 20 or 30 years of looking back of how it transformed software engineering and the industry.
There probably was some, questioning in terms of like, oh, is this going to mean anyone can be a developer? I think is often the refrain, whether it's, that era, whether it's web development, whether it's, copilots and AI assistants now. I remember that same pushback when Java came out and .NET came out. It was sort of like, no real developer would ever use garbage collection. It really should be, malloc and free. I think the history of development and the history of computing is really around how do we continue to optimize the productivity. And, I think what makes a developer successful or have impact, is not syntax, and it's not unnecessary writing of code that can be automated. It's often the logic, it's identifying a problem, it's the creativity, and it's often the problem solving to make it work. And I think developers that embrace the new technology and build on top of it end up being so much more productive, which ultimately means that they have better careers, they're more impactful. And so, I always encourage people to kind of don't assume your value is the syntax that you're familiar with. Assume the value is a higher level thing that you can leverage. And, I think it's true both for developer tools and languages, especially in the context of AI now. But I think it's also true in terms of cloud platforms. I talked in my keynote this morning at Build about ChatGPT. And, if ChatGPT had been built 10 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, a company would need to build their own data centers. They would need to build their own operating system. They would need to build their own deployment orchestrator. They need to build their own database.
Google had to do like 20 or 30 years ago.
That's exactly what Google had to do. And the fact that they were able to leverage things like Cosmos DB and our Azure Kubernetes service, they now have an app that's the fastest growing in history with 500 million weekly users. And one of the stats I put in the keynote was they have a total of 12 people on their infrastructure team that manages all their Kubernetes and compute infrastructure. And that type of productivity is stunning. And so I do think I would encourage, if you're a developer, embrace the technology and the productivity that's coming. And it only makes you more successful and have more impact. And there's more than enough problems that are still left to solve.
So after Visual Basic, one of the big years was 1997. I guess for two reasons. Was that the year that I remember that you joined Microsoft?
I did. I joined Microsoft full time in '96. I was actually an intern in '96. But I joined out of college. I think I graduated like May of '97, and I joined Microsoft on June 16th.
And obviously, in the history books, we don't look back on you joining specifically, but it was Visual Studio released, and of course, later Visual Studio became this really, really powerful developer tools. I started my career working on Microsoft technologies and Visual Studio. So back then, like, you were at Microsoft as an intern before this came out, this Visual Studio came out. What was the
story behind why did Microsoft decide to double down? There were developer tools, like there was, I think Microsoft had their Quick C, there were things that kind of, like, compared to Visual Studio, they looked like very kind of early versions, but there were things like that. How did this whole development come about? And then why did Microsoft decide to just double and triple down on it?
Well, I think one of the big things that happened, really, and we kind of really started the project in 98 was both the real emergence of Visual Studio as a tool and then also .NET. And they kind of, in 2000, we unveiled kind of .NET and Visual Studio .NET together at the PDC conference in July of 2000, if I remember. And, the impetus behind that was, Visual Basic had been hugely successful in the mid to late 90s. And, but there was still this gap in between where you had Visual Basic or Visual Fox Pro, and then you had on the right-hand side in the more advanced category, C++. And, C++ was, and still is, a key programming language, but
and there was MFC, right? The MFC library.
There's MFC libraries.
Which I guess you can't talk about Windows development with, it wasn't just C++, MFC made it like so productive.
Yeah. And there was also a thing called ATL,
ATL.
Which is another library. I haven't thought of that in a long time, but yeah. So we had a couple different framework libraries, but it's still, if you use C++, MFC made a huge difference, but it wasn't as productive as it could be. And there was this sort of gap in the between. And part of why we created .NET was to sort of say, okay, can we create this common language runtime that could handle VB, could handle a C++-like language, and could handle a bunch of languages in between. And then, could we also avoid each language having to have its own programming framework? And so like MFC only worked with C++. It didn't work with VB. The VB designer didn't work with C++. And, instead, could we build a common set of developer tools, whether it was debugging, whether it was around visual design, whether it was around code optimization, profiling, etc., IntelliSense, and leverage it. And that's where really .NET and Visual Studio really took root. And what basically we came up with the common language runtime. I started a project called ASP.NET with Mark Anders, the two of us, and that was a web framework.
And when did that start compared to .NET? So like, did .NET come first, or was ASP.NET parallel to all of this?
Sort of parallel. I mean, basically, ASP.NET started, I kind of wrote the original prototype over Christmas 97 to 98.
Wow.
And it was, the prototype I wrote was, I used some C++, some JavaScript, and some Java. It was kind of it was more the idea as opposed to, there was no code that was actually reused. But it was, it was this idea of like, okay, could you use classes? Could you use objects? And could you have language productivity that allowed you to kind of work very quickly? And so Mark and I started showing it to a lot of people internally and got a lot of excitement around it. Sort of in parallel at the same time frame, the common language runtime got started. It wasn't called .NET, but it was called Core. Was the original, I think, code name. And but they were kind of building a runtime that could do languages. They didn't have libraries, but they had languages. And then Visual Studio was trying to figure out, okay, we have the VB IDE, we have the Visual C++ IDE, we have this Java IDE. How do we merge that?
Yeah, J#, right?
J#, and then it all kind of came together. And so in the process of 98, these three teams sort of found each other, and we started working together. And 99, we built a whole bunch of stuff, including Windows libraries and for GUI and for other things. And then ultimately, we were supposed to release it to the world. I think it was like the equivalent of build. We called it the PDC back then.
Yeah. I
think it was supposed to be February or March of 2000, and we were late. And so we slipped it to July. And July 2000 was when we kind of unveiled it at a big event, much like the build event we're doing today, and showed the world like languages, frameworks, and tools all working together. And that was kind of really the unveiling of .NET and tools. And it was pretty critical for us, our success in the 90s or the 2000s. In the same way that VB really helped drive Windows Client, .NET really helped Windows Server and SQL Server, and really introduced Microsoft to a generation of server programmers.
Yeah, and I think one of the most iconic, videos and now memes is Steve Ballmer yelling developers, 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 sweating in the t-shirt. And usually that's the only part that gets quoted and people think, Microsoft was all about developers. But when you watch the whole thing, which I did, the whole thing that he said, he starts at, okay, what's a $64,000 question? What the hell are we supposed to do with .NET, Steve? And then he goes developer. So as I understand, this was about, before the .NET release, about how to reach developers with .NET. Like, can you bring a little bit more behind the meme? Because I feel there's way more depth in his, statement.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't at that event, so I don't have all the context. But I think the main point that Steve was trying to get across, and you see it if you ever watch the video, is just the passion he had around developers, and his main point was just developers really matter. And so when people say, why are you doing all this? It's because of developers and developers. And I think that is kind of the just a critical nature, which is, again, if you want to build a platform, if you want to have an ecosystem, you have to have developers. And ultimately developers are the ones that both build the most interesting solutions and they also push the platform and apps the hardest. And, I think that was his main goal, was just to get across to the audience just how passionate he was around that. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about press. It's really around, are you winning the hearts and minds of developers? And I think that's a big part of why, Microsoft Build is special is, even take today's keynotes, it's, tons of demos, lots of hands-on, live demos, hands-on, lots of labs. It really is an opportunity for developers to get together, and it's not about sort of chest pumping. It's more around, here's what you can do, and how do we, have a good conversation and dialogue around, what can we do better at Microsoft, but also how can we make you successful?
And so .NET was huge when it launched with Visual Studio hand in hand. But a third part of why I think it was really successful at the time was C# itself. Where does C# come from? Was it well, it must have come from inside Microsoft, but was it before .NET? Was it during .NET? Because I do remember that C# kept evolving as well with new features. Yep. Well, hand in hand with .NET. Like, Link, for example, was a good example where it's both a language feature, but you needed framework support as well.
Well, the real genius behind C# is Anders Hejlsberg, or at least, especially in the early days. And, Anders is still at Microsoft. He's still building languages. I mean, he also is responsible for TypeScript. Before Microsoft, Anders worked at Borland, which is a name that most people, if you're not my age, don't remember. But it was it was an iconic developer tools company in the early 90s, late 80s, and built some amazing tools, one of which was called Turbo Pascal.
Yep.
And Anders was the guy who wrote Turbo Pascal, and he wrote it originally from Denmark. I think he wrote it when he was in Denmark and sold it or licensed it to Borland. And, part of what made Turbo Pascal revolutionary, this even came out before, I think, VB, Visual Basic, was it was just lightning fast. And so you could literally, on a PC with 256K of RAM, it had an editor, it had a debugger, and if you hit run, in a few seconds, your Pascal app would work. And, he added good language features into Pascal and really built that. And, we were very fortunate. He joined Microsoft in the mid-90s, along with a bunch of Borland employees, and really brought both that developer ethos. He kind of really helped rejuvenate the developer ethos at the time, and then also just a language sensibility. And, I've worked with Anders now for 25 plus years, and he's absolute genius in terms of understanding both what to add into a language and what not to. And there's a real aesthetic where it's easy to kind of just throw in the kitchen sink into a language, but how do you make these things make sense? How do you, you mentioned Link, which was a language query technology. And, I think part of what made the elegance of Link at the time so great was it built on generics, which was also built into the language, which then composed into the runtime.
Yeah, and generics in C# was very powerful.
Yeah. And it was, at the time, it was a big differentiator versus Java, which didn't have generics when C# first introduced it. And just the way that Anders kind of saw over multiple generations, okay, we're going to add generics into the CLR, we're going to add it into the language, and then the next version we're going to come up with LINQ. And it's been sort of a mastery to see. And I think versus other languages, there's great continuity throughout it. Versus different languages, I think sometimes have taken kind of a left turn or a right turn, and not always a kind of linear progression, and they've taken detours. And I think it's been great to see the way Anders is, both with C# and then also with TypeScript, has kind of had a vision that he's built on top of that really has a bunch of consistency and sort of common direction over time.
And then in the early and mid and late 2000s, the Microsoft ecosystem was really special in the sense when I worked at one of my first companies, we were paying $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 per developer to access Visual Studio together with C#, ASP.NET, getting access to the different software like SQL Server and IIS so we could develop and use them because the licenses were very expensive otherwise. And to MSDN library. Now, I just want to pause on the MSDN library because I've never really seen a company do this before or after, where this was before Stack Overflow and even before having good things on the internet. We would pay to access really, really good documentation. Early on, it was sent out on CDs because they were so big. Do you remember, how or why did Microsoft get this idea of, let's just invest in documentation, especially because as a developer, I'm going to be honest, it's usually one of the last things I come around to.
Yeah, I feel like I'm dating myself on this podcast, but, I think for a lot of listeners, the idea of, buying documentation sounds weird.
These days, yes, but back then
it was pretty revolutionary. And part of it was, back, when I joined Microsoft or was an intern, the internet was still very, very new, and there wasn't a search engine out there that was very good. And this was all pre-Google, pre-Bing. And, HTML was still pretty rudimentary. I remember up until about 2002, 2003, a lot of sites did not even rely on JavaScript or at most used very, very minimal JavaScript because some browsers didn't support it. This is pre-CSS. And so as a result, the idea of searching for documentation and reading it in HTML in a browser was just not done. And so, the original impetus, I think, between MSDN in the 90s was this subscription service. And you got
every quarter, every month, you got the CD.
Yeah, you got a lot of CDs. I remember it was 50 CDs sometimes.
Yeah,
it would have all the updated applications. So it would have all the Microsoft operating systems, databases, developer tools. I think even Office at one point was included.
Yeah, more and more things came into it.
And then you had tons and tons of CDs with the documentation, and so you could kind of install it, and then you could search and. That coupled with IntelliSense, which is or statement completion, which is another thing that I think a lot of people take for granted now. And then the other thing that I think we also take for granted is debuggers. I remember when I was in university, the debugging experience was often printf statements and or a command line debugger that was very rudimentary. You could kind of dump your symbols or registers. But it wasn't like debugging today. And so, as a result, the MSDN was for a different time, I guess. It's a little quaint. But it evolved over time. And part of it also became this notion of a subscription service where your apps were always up to date. And so I think at some point, the documentation just turned on to be on the internet. But the notion of the apps was still.
But I think one of my takeaways is that when I think back, I was at a startup, a small company, 50-person company. It was actually in Hungary. We didn't have that much revenue or income compared to the US. And my employer still paid that $1,000 or $2,000 per developer per year because the developers were so much more productive using this whole Microsoft stack. And I know things have changed, but to me, that point in time is just a bit of a reminder that there is a big premium on just being so much more productive than anything else. Because back then, everything was already together. I think we take these days, it's so everything that we're amazed about having documentation of working debugger, software that you can use for free, for database software, that was SQL Server back then. But it was all there, and I wonder if we'll move this notion that a company that everything's so much better and built an ecosystem that just worked. It was really valuable. It probably applies today as well. Like maybe not in a like a multi-$1,000 subscription, but something is there. Like there's I just vividly remember how like no one forced anyone to use Microsoft, and it was not about Microsoft. It was just about like there was this thing. It just we're working faster, especially when we were building either the first websites because ASP.NET was still. There was a point where 25% of all sites were ASP.NET based on various things. After launch, it just went up on this thing, and I assume this must. Do you have theories on why that was? I mean, your ASP.NET was your baby, a little bit.
Well, I think the general thing. I think it's true for pretty much every field. In fact, when it comes to technology, is people like things that make them more productive and let them do more faster, cheaper. I think it's always worth reflecting because like on just, imagine 10 or 15 years ago what the world looked like. If you were going to an event like this, you would either rent a car or, you'd stand in line for a long taxi and whether it would get you there, whether you get ripped off. No one, now you have Uber or Lyft, similarly coffee. Or a coffee maker, you'd go and find a store and try 8 of them and you'd search a job. Now you can order on Amazon and it'll show up same day or next day delivery. And so, I do think we kind of overlook the productivity that's changed in just 10 years on a regular basis.
It's now baseline, right?
Yeah. When you step back and think about what the world looked like back then, even 5 or 10 years ago, it's completely different. And I think that's going to be very much true for AI. And when we look at the kind of productivity that something like GitHub Copilot has, or other AI assistance tools provide, it's going to be like that printf and the debugger kind of story I told earlier, or it's going to be also kind of a quantum leap in terms of productivity. And at the end of the day, if you're getting more productive and saving time, companies and developers are willing to pay for it. If the developer can make more money because they're using those tools.
We see from the past, like very hard money. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Modal, the cloud platform that makes AI development simple. Need GPUs without the headache? With Modal, just add one line of code to any Python function and boom, it's running in the cloud on your choice of CPU or GPU. And the best part, you only pay for what you use. With sub-second container starts and instant scaling to thousands of GPUs, it's no wonder companies like Suno, Ramp, and Substack already trust Modal for their AI applications. Getting an H100 is just a pip install away. Go to modal.com/pragmatic to get $30 in free credits every month. That is modal.com/pragmatic.
I just wanted to touch on, just briefly on Windows Phone. Windows Phone was... I was a Windows Phone developer. In fact, I think that's where we connected on one of the events when Microsoft was about to launch Windows Phone. There was pre-launch events. And to this date, when people ask me what I think about development on iOS, development on Android, I tell them the best development experience I've had was on Windows Phone. So Windows Phone, many listeners will have not used it for obvious reasons, but I was a huge fan, not because of Microsoft or anything, but it had some really forward-looking features like live tiles, which are now kind of a given everywhere, but it was years ahead of it. And the development experience was so smooth. We had that first-class debugger, we had the simulator that just worked. And, in the end, Windows Phone is now history, but you were there when Windows Phone was born, throughout its rise, and then in the end when Microsoft decided to discontinue it. What are some learnings that you have on building platforms and delighting developers, and what works and what doesn't?
Yeah, it's there were some great tools. I mean, I ran the Windows Phone development tool team at one point, amongst other things, but so I was involved on the developer tool side for Windows Phone. I didn't work on the Windows Phone team itself, but we kind of took .NET and C# and Silverlight technology and XAML and Visual Studio, and I think to your point, I think we had some really great tools that were pretty differentiated.
Tools were really good.
I think that if there were 2 or 3 lessons from Windows Phone, for me at least from a development perspective, I think one was, which is true, I think in technology in general, which is if you're not number 1, you got to be number 2, because it's really hard to be number 3 and number 4 in the market and ever catch up. And so in some ways, the Windows Phone project started after the iPhone was released, and or the modern Windows Phone that you like. And I think Windows Phone would have had a shot, other than Android came out, and came out beforehand, a short amount of time. And I think it was really a question of whether Android or Windows Phone was going to be the number two in the market. And I think if we'd been a year earlier, maybe it would have turned out differently. I think the other thing is the need to kind of connect with developers broadly. And that means we supported Windows Phone, Windows as the development experience, but it didn't work on the Mac. And if you think about to 2009, 2010, if you went to a developer conference, a huge number of people were using Macs. They were using open source. And so, basically saying, okay, you got to install Windows on your Mac and use it in order to build an app, was a huge issue. And then I think also at that time, designers were exclusively Mac, and to some extent today they still are. But and so that combination was also headwind. And that combination I think was the reason why ultimately it didn't get the escape velocity, and that's why I think speed matters in platform shifts. Well, and that was true for Windows. That was true, even in the context of Azure. When we first launched Azure, I think we were number 7 in the market on cloud providers, and thankfully we were able to become number 2.
Yeah, and let's talk about Azure, because after Windows Phone, maybe even during Windows Phone, as I understand, you were a big part of the Azure team, even creating Azure. How did Azure start, and how, especially, I think we just need to remind ourselves that this was back then where Windows was everywhere. The internet was just, I guess, starting up. Some visionaries might have seen it, but it was not that obvious that it would be as big as it would be. Microsoft was making so much money from Windows licenses and selling developer tools. CDs were arriving on the mail. And then, there was some big investment, lots of people starting to work on this thing called Azure, which didn't, now we know it's big, but back then it wasn't. Like, what was your conviction, and how did this whole project get off the ground? Especially, as you said, you were number 7 when you started.
Well, I think we introduced Azure to the world in the 2008 PDC. So it's kind of the equivalent of build. So in 2008. And I think it went general availability in 2010. So the 2008 was kind of a preview. And, back then in 2010, cloud was still very new. I mean, Amazon was the leader. But there were lots of, I call it hosting companies, Rackspace and Joyent and a whole bunch of companies, that probably are less familiar name-wise today, that different companies had cloud solutions, but they were really kind of more hosting solutions. Azure did have, when it came out, it pioneered this idea of platform as a service, meaning kind of some higher level services that made it easier for developers to build solutions. But I would say the platform is, it had some usability issues in that time frame, and it also did not support Linux or open source at all, and the tooling was not great. I'd say by 2010, when it went general availability, it wasn't doing super well in the market. Hence, I think we were like number 7 or number 8 or number 6. I can't remember what it was. But beginning of 2011, I think Satya took over what was in the server and tools business where Azure lived. And I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, he kind of wandered into my office and said, "Hey, how would you like to work on Azure?" At the time I was in the developer division, for some reason I said yes. At the time, a lot of people, emailed me and they're like, "What are you doing? This is career suicide. This is not going to go anywhere." And so, after we announced it, and I got lots of mail from people telling me I'd made a huge mistake. There was a brief moment I was like, well, maybe I made a mistake. I don't know. But, this idea of having kind of this cloud-based computer that you could build build solutions on top of and run them at scale and dramatically change the curve of productivity as well as success for startups and small companies and big companies, was enticing. And so, I think I started in 2011. One of the first things we did was, that's kind of gone down in lore, was I kind of worked on the project for maybe 60 days, played with the product a lot, and said, gosh, we have a lot of things to fix. And so we had sort of this offsite where we brought together all the senior leaders and architects into a room. And I went to Safeway and bought these sort of Visa credit cards that were like prepaid. and gave one to each table. And we mixed the teams up and we said, okay, you're going to build an app. And we have 2 days to build an app together, starting with signing up. And, half the people couldn't figure out how to sign up. And, half the people struggled to get the tools installed. The documentation was out of date. It didn't work. And, the idea was just, can you build a Hello World app? And it was an eye-opener, I think, to a lot of people of like, I thought my part was great, but no one can use it. And, we used that offsite at the end. I kind of went to the whiteboard and said, okay, let's list all the things we need to fix over the next year. And we kind of created a punch list.
Just starting as a new user who wants
starting with a website and sign up, start with documentation. Let's start with the developer tools. Hey, we probably need to support open source. Yeah, we created this punch list, and 12 months later, we relaunched Azure in 2012. Started to get some good traction, and as part of that, we also supported Linux. We supported VMs, which
that was a huge change. I still
Azure
remember.
Originally didn't do, and then in 2014, we renamed Azure to be Microsoft Azure. Back then, before that, it was Windows Azure, and then as part of that, we also very much focused on businesses because we realized Amazon really owned the consumer startup space, and which was the biggest market in cloud at that time. And, I think one of the things that was part of my lessons from watching the Windows Phone project was if you simply try to do exactly what your competitor does and they're ahead of you, it's hard to catch up. Pick a beachhead that is small enough to win, big enough to matter. And we sort of said, let's be the cloud for modern business. It was kind of the tagline. It was a hybrid, take advantage of cloud, use cloud, connect to the existing enterprise you already have. And we were able to kind of build differentiation in Azure that went after a segment that was still pretty small at the time and Amazon wasn't great at. And that was the key thing that kind of took us from like number 7 to number 2 was people said, okay, I get why I might use Amazon and Azure. And it helped us get some of that escape velocity and put us in second place. And then we've kind of grown every year since then. And now we have done, it's ChatGPT and we have lots of other
now we're going
a much broader market. But it helped us in 2014 to 2016 or 17 that we were kind of great at hybrid cloud and Amazon kind of didn't want to go after that space. And as a result, that really helped us accelerate and become relevant.
Yeah, this is probably a good lesson for even like small startups who are in a very crowded space, let's say with AI, like, look at the places that might be a bit more opportunity.
If you can find an underserved market where people are desperate for a solution, that's a great place, whether you're a startup or you're an established company, to kind of build a new product. If all you're doing is building the same thing that your competitor's doing, but you're coming out later without as much share, it's really, really hard, the history of computing, to catch up.
So you mentioned open source, and a big shift in the 2010s was open source. Microsoft did have a bit of it felt to me, a half-hearted attempt with something called Codeplex. A lot of people will not remember it. It was basically like, hey, host your stuff on Codeplex. You can choose your license or you can upload a license, but most projects were like non-permissive licenses. You could see the source code, but the license was just not there. And then something happened. So the weird thing was that Microsoft did have this solution, Codeplex, and it was popular with Microsoft. One of my old companies used it. And then Microsoft started to just first embrace GitHub. Obviously, there was a acquisition of GitHub, but even before, I think Microsoft already started to do a lot more permissive open source. I think the Ajax toolkit might have been one of the first ones to go out there. What happened then? Was this coming from internally from below? Was it like leaders like yourself saying, all right, we should just just be a lot more serious about open source, like proper open source?
Yeah, I think it was very much a cultural shift in the company, and then also a business model shift. I mean, I think ultimately there was philosophical things about open source, but I think a lot of Microsoft's early hesitation around open source was really around business model. And I think it's true today. Even I think if you look at any company and what they're doing, start with what is their business model, and often what they do is driven by the business model. And so if you are social media, you care a lot about advertising because that is your business model. And so when you think about privacy or you think about data protection, your position on that matters a lot as to whether you can monetize and, pay the rent. And, similarly, I think if you are a hardware company you care a lot about the hardware, and your business model is really around selling the hardware. And so you care about, a different set of things. And, we were at the time in the early 90s or late 90s and in early 2000s, most of our money came from commercial software licenses. And so the idea that like you could buy one copy and give it to everyone,
For free.
for free was kind of a scary thing at that time. And so, I think so part of our kind of concern around open source was really grounded, frankly, in business model. And then I think there was also kind of a misunderstanding of what is open source. And, back then there was sort of GPL and, if you checked in one line of code, would it, the license mean that like you just gave away all your IP? And so there was still in those early days, there was a little bit of misunderstanding. It was before, GPL kind of modified the license a little bit and clarified a little bit what it meant. But I think there was also some fear, uncertainty, and doubt that a lot of companies, not just Microsoft, kind of had around it. And so, that was the 90s. I think what changed in the late 90s, and I probably played a big role in this, was just recognizing, but if you're a new developer, trying to say you need to pay us money for everything, whereas something else, and that you can't see the code, you can't help contribute to the code, you can't participate in the development, you're swimming against the tide. And, at the end of the day, if you are a new or an old developer in that time frame, you kind of want to be able to see the code. You want to be able to contribute. And so, we took some early steps, and it was a little bit, as you mentioned, the Ajax toolkit, I think was the first thing we open source.
I think it was. I talked to some folks at Microsoft. So,
and I remember another big step we did was we added jQuery, going back memory lane, which was at the time one of the most popular. I think actually Prototype was the most popular, and jQuery was the up and coming because it was really streamlined.
Yeah, it overtook it in no time.
It overtook it, but we kind of added it into the ASP.NET template inside Visual Studio, and that was also considered groundbreaking at the time. I mean, in hindsight, this all sounds trite, I guess, but at the time it was a big thing because suddenly we were taking licenses. I think they're both, like it was MIT or BSD license, and incorporating it into our commercial product, and it was, it was a bit of we crossed a bridge or a Rubicon. And people said, okay, I guess the sky didn't fall in, and maybe we could do more. And so, it was a bit of a journey to kind of take the company through it. But probably my team in particular helped a lot with that. And then the other thing that really changed in the kind of early 2000s, or 2010, 2011, 2012, was just recognizing that also in the cloud world, you could be very successful if all your customers only use Linux and open source.
Yeah.
Because the business model did also change.
Yeah.
And
so now people are paying for compute, for resources, for services, for all the added abstractions if you need it.
And we also then recognized at the time that if you didn't really have developers' hearts and minds, they weren't going to pay any attention to the cloud platform that you put out, or the tools you put out, or the databases you put out. And so, we kind of went through this shift over a couple years where I think both culturally, we kind of brought the company along of like, hey, this is not scary, this is good. And then also business model wise, we had permission to kind of experiment and take risks where you could say, okay, let's make it free or let's make it open source. And
which leads us into Visual Studio Code. In 2015, if you would have asked me like, what is unlikely to happen, I would have said like that people use more of Microsoft's IDE, which was Visual Studio. Again, you still had to pay a bunch of money. It was amazing. I came from that world. But when I moved to new companies, they were like, let's use open source stuff. Let's use free stuff. We use Atom or Sublime, or maybe we might have paid for JetBrains, but people usually like to just, use a worse experience, but it was open source, hackable. And then out of seemingly nowhere, VS Code came out, which is, it's free to use. There's no like tricky things around it. And it just felt, again, a bit incredible to me because just knowing how Microsoft used to base their all developer business on pay for quality tools, it just seemed impossible. How did that happen inside? What was the thinking? And now, of course, most developers use VS Code or a fork of VS Code.
Yeah, so I'd been out of the developer division when I took over Azure. So from 2011 to say 2014, I hadn't been in the developer division. I've been focused on Azure. And then when Satya took over as CEO in 2014, the same day I kind of took over his old job. And that included DevDiv. And so that kind of came back into my world. And, I think one of the things that we did in the early days of 2014 was I kind of just looked around and said, I think we have an opportunity to make a couple of choices that will be bold and aggressive that give us a shot to re-win relevance with developers of the world. And if we don't, we're going to be on an iceberg that's going to slowly melt. And at some point, we're going to be swimming. And so, we kind of had a set of meetings in spring of 2014 and kind of wrote on the whiteboard, let's be bold, and came up with kind of three big things that we said, okay, what can we do to become more relevant? The first one was we actually introduced a community edition of Visual Studio. So previously, if you wanted to use Visual Studio and take advantage of the features that that developers loved, you had to pay a minimum of about $1,000 to do it. And we said, okay, let's make it free. And it was scary for a lot of people at the time, but we said, look, we can make it for small projects, for startups, for independent developers that want to build something, and let's make the full feature set available. And so that was decision number one. Decision number two is let's open source .NET. And let's make it cross-platform
with Mono.
And it was less with Mono. We actually took our base libraries.
Sorry. Mono was before. Yeah,
Mono was before.
Yeah, but we said, because there's no alternative, and now there's no need for Mono.
And then we said let's open source it and do it right.
Yeah,
not meaning just open source where we can contribute code, but true open source. We want the community to contribute code and do it under the right license and put it on GitHub. That was big decision number two, and we make it and have a great Linux and Mac port, and make them first class. And so that was kind of decision number two. And then decision number three was, as much as we love Visual Studio, the IDE, let's also recognize increasingly web developers and those that are not using a compiled language are looking for something that's much more of a lightweight code optimized editor. And there was a great project that had been started. It was basically a web-based editor, written in Node, written in TypeScript, but you ran it in a VS Online, I think is what we called it.
Oh yeah, VS Online, yes.
And it was great technology, but at the time people weren't really looking to write code in a browser, and people would say, well, it's great if I want to edit 5 or 6 lines of code, but it's not it doesn't have a debugger, it doesn't have IntelliSense, it doesn't, it wouldn't scale for a large project. And, we said, what if, I think I kind of said, why don't you take this, and is there a way that you could package it up in a, Mac and Windows and Linux, shell, and add file system support? And why don't we take this open source debugger we're about to do in .NET and port it and make it work with it, and really, don't have a project system was kind of one of the mantras, and really focus on streamlining editing and let's make it open source. The three different decisions we made, and we kind of made all those decisions, I think, in about an hour and a half. So it was a good meeting.
That was a good one.
If honestly, if you asked what was the risk probability of each one succeeding, I thought the first one, which is making the tools free, was going to definitely drive more developer usage. Whether it was going to destroy the Visual Studio revenue, I don't know. But I said, let's take that risk. I think the .NET being open source, I thought would help, and it certainly did. And then the VS Code one was the most, I would say, speculative, where I thought I think this could help, but I don't know. There's a lot of other editors out there. There was Atom, there was Sublime, there was a couple other ones that were only Mac.
And then later new ones are like NeoVim, etc.
Yeah, and so it was of the three decisions, they were all very big. I think the ones that we remember the most would be VS Code and then the open sourcing of .NET. And ironically, the one that I thought would have the biggest impact was probably the one that had the least impact, although it helped a tremendous amount.
Yeah, but it comes to tell you can never know, even from the inside.
But basically, I think later in that year we kind of announced all three, and that really, I think, helped us with our next kind of, I'll call it, rejuvenation with the developer community. And in some ways also the VS Code, I remember doing events in 2015, 2016 with a lot of the GitHub team, which was then an independent company. And, VS Code also was that bridge that I think earned us the credibility to talk to GitHub and to be sort of in the developer community at large. And, was the bridge that kind of started the conversation around ultimately GitHub becoming part of Microsoft, which, if you went back to 2010,
It was impossible to imagine.
It would be the most crazy suggestion ever. And then, frankly, I think beyond the fact that the GitHub team wouldn't want to have been bought or be part of Microsoft, I think the developer community would have left immediately. And yet we, fast forward to 2017, I think was when we did the acquisition. People had some concern, but they said, let's tell you what, you've earned the right. We're going to give you a chance.
Yeah, there's a lot of skepticism as well. I agree, but yeah, and then now it brings us today actually to build where Copilot, built by the GitHub team, we know the AI assistant with a bunch of advanced capabilities is now open source as well, together with VS Code.
Yeah.
So now that we're here, just like looking ahead, we are where we are with lots of exciting new tools, lots of new ways to work, and I think we're going to figure out their agents are the hot thing. Personally, what are you excited about in terms of developer tools and also cloud? When you look at, may these be projects, may these be directions or things that need to be figured out?
I think the thing I get excited most about is certainly on the developer tool side, I do think this notion of having an agent that works with us. And that's, some of the demos we showed today and yesterday of, how can you assign an issue in GitHub to your Copilot? I think a lot of us have used, whether it's GitHub Copilot, whether it's ChatGPT or M365 Copilot or Cursor, people are used to kind of a request response model where it's you type something, you get a response immediately, and that's super powerful. So that's not going away. But this notion as the models get richer that you can just assign a task to effectively a coworker that is AI that can do something over maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes and then assign it back to you. I think that is super profound. And so the ability to say, hey, take this Figma or take this screenshot that I've sketched out, turn it into a nice HTML with CSS, or, create for me, a Kubernetes deployment file and a basic microservice architecture that has these 5 dimensions and is connected to these 3 resources, and make it scalable and secure, like assign it to the Copilot, grab a coffee, come back and get something back. That I think is really profound. And then how do you extend that so that in addition to development, a lot of kind of what you might think of as the operation tasks or SRE, things like, hey, is there anomaly detection in my logs? Is the performance dropping? Why? Can you ask it what changed in the environment? What changed in the code base? What's changed in terms of the user behavior? How do you have an AI agent that can kind of assist you in that? I think that's really about kind of giving every developer superpowers. And, it's kind of like the Marvel Iron Man. Suddenly you have a suit that gives you kind of these amazing superpowers. I think to some extent these types of copilots are going to do that. And then when you combine it with a cloud like Azure, where if you've got a great idea and you're going into business as a startup, or whether you're a big company, the ability to run it in 70 regions around the world, and certainly right now when you think about whether it's tariffs or whether it's geopolitical, okay, how do I meet every country's local residency requirements on data? Cloud is the way to do that. Similarly, if you think about, how do you target the growing markets in the world, cloud is the way you do that. And then when you start thinking about, how do I actually build my own AI application and take advantage of the latest models? How do I use diffusion or fine tune my own model that's based on, say, my own data, or do post-training? That's the cloud's going to be the way you do that. And so I get excited in terms of when you take these sort of tools, tying it back to the beginning of the conversation, going back to MFC and Visual Basic, I think this is the same level of kind of exponential jump, but probably even more profound in terms of the impact, because it's not just development, it's also runtime. And then it's that feedback loop of, okay, now I get something out there, I'm learning from my user behavior, let me improve it. And that's the thing that always motivates me is can you ultimately make someone more successful? And if you can allow them to take an idea and run with it faster and do it faster, better, cheaper. You can change their life and you can bring to life this great idea. And if you can do that at scale, it's a fun journey.
And as closing, hearing about like AI colleagues can be a little scary for as engineers. I think it's a similarly big shift as back, if you think back in the 90s, anyone can program with like dragging and dropping and doing similar stuff that I'm doing right now. What would your advice be for software engineer today, like, mid-level or experienced engineers who want to be the, standout engineers of tomorrow on how to approach this and how to think about the fact that now a lot of the work that they have been valuable for until now can potentially be offloaded. It's a little bit, you see what I mean? It kind of messes with your mind a bit.
It does. I mean, I think the thing I'd probably say encourage is, like, I'm a big student of history. I like technology history. I've been part of, and I study sometimes, but I also like to look back and, the last 500 years of history and read lots of biographies. And, history is a way of repeating itself. And, like just going back to the development community for a while, like I remember in the early 2000s, people would come to developer conferences and they would literally have T-shirts that said "IntelliSense rots the mind." Because like no real developer,
and IntelliSense was a really good autocomplete.
Like no real developer would use autocomplete was kind of the statement at the time. Real developers, knew the name of the method and the parameters
and the classes. Yeah,
and similarly, I think type safety when .NET was introduced. C++ developers were like, type safety is for wimps. I mean, like, it's just all you need is a void star pointer. And, if you got it wrong, you'd crash. But, like, who needs type safety? And similarly, I think, even when JavaScript emerged in HTML5, people would say like, well, you can't really have a real app with HTML and JavaScript.
We had the thing, it's not a real language, JavaScript. I remember this one.
And so, all these parallels, I kind of, and then going back to, the days of debuggers, real developers don't use debuggers or profilers. And so it's, I've heard these things before where people say, you can, and certainly with cloud, I've certainly heard lots of people say, well, I can run my private cloud cheaper and faster and better than you can. And it's like, okay, most of those companies are not in business anymore, but sure, go for it. And so I do think, that would be my only kind of history lesson I'd pass on, which is, generally these things are frightening sometimes because they do make it look like, wow, could this automate me? Could this replace my job? But ultimately, if you embrace the productivity, you suddenly discover you can do a lot more and you can deliver a lot more. And that is really what makes you valuable. It's not whether or not you know the name of the method and are proud that you remember the 18 parameters to it. It's what does the method do? And does the application calling the method accomplish some value? And so to the extent that we can leverage AI to kind of make developers more successful, I think we in the limit, it's going to create more jobs, not less. And I think ultimately it means those jobs are going to be higher paying because the business value you're delivering to the company or the startup or
going up.
Your app that you're building becomes even greater. So, it's not always a perfectly linear progression, but I think that's, if I look again back in history, garbage collection, IntelliSense, debuggers, type safety, even open source, those are all things that were proven right, and the naysayers were proven wrong over time.
Yeah, and I guess it's just good to remind that open source, I think from the outside, we would not think it's scary, but from the inside, like Microsoft, it was, and it turned out pretty good.
It worked out pretty well.
So thank you very much, Scott. This was so much fun.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks to Scott for this trip down memory lane and for his advice on how software engineers can keep growing in an industry that changes as fast as software engineering does. For more details about Microsoft's developer tools evolution, check out our deep dive into Pragmatic Engineer linked in the show notes below. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. A special thank you if you also leave a rating on the show. Thanks, and see you in the next one.